Welcome to the Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast. My name is Lizzie Harewood. I'm here with Graham, as usual. Hi, Graham.
Hello.
And we are delighted to be joined by Steve Midgley. Steve, welcome to the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and what you're here to talk about?
Very lovely to be with you. Thanks for inviting me to join. I'm based in Cambridge, where we've lived for just coming up to 25 years now. And for most of that time, I was the senior pastor of an Anglican church in the city centre. And then just over 3 years ago, stepped back from that role in order to be more fully involved in the leadership of an organisation called Biblical Counselling UK. And what other things would be useful to know about me? Married with 3 adult children, and moved into the grandparenting era, which is a great delight.
Wow, what an honour.
Yeah. Does Cambridge feel different to other cities, or have you lived there so long you can't really compare?
Good question, Graham. Maybe we all think the cities we live in are sort of different and peculiar. I think there probably are some peculiarities. There is partly associated with the university, partly associated with lots of startup companies. There is quite a big churn of people, and so whilst you've got you've got a baseline. So I still attend the church where I was senior pastor, and while we have a sort of a baseline of long-term Cambridge residents, there is on top of that a kind of a flow through of people who come and go. Sometimes only in Cambridge for a year, 3 years, and that is both delightful and also can be a little bit sad and frustrating when you get to know some lovely people and then you know that you're only going to be around for a short time.
That tends to be the kind of the pattern in many large university towns, doesn't it? Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't have that problem because I live in Doncaster and there's absolutely no university here, although there are some qualifications associated with Doncaster College you can do that have that higher education mark, but every town or city has their own kind of
and it does make a big difference to church.
it does. Yeah.
I did my first when I was a curate for 4 years on the south coast in a place called Hove next to Brighton, and it was an incredibly stable population. And having lived in London and Oxford before that, it was unfamiliar to me. And by the end of my 4 years there, I think what I really appreciated was that that there were sort of 3 generations of people within the church.
Yeah.
The depth of relationship and the depth of knowledge of one another was so rich. And I've always thought that's something very beautifove.
Yeah.
And it makes for strong relationships in a church.
Yeah. It's funny you call it a place called Hove. This is really near to us. It's not a place called Hove, it's Hove.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us about Biblical Counselling UK. Maybe unpick each of those words, or the 3. Biblical, and it's to do with counselling, and it's UK. Is there something to think about all those 3 things?
Yeah, it's an unfamiliar term to many, though it has been an approach that has been very influential in the church in the United States for coming up to 60 years. But for various reasons, which I guess we won't go into, and it's speculation, why did it never really take off in the UK? There have been little flares of interest during that 60 years, but nothing substantial, really, until the last 10 years or so, when a more considerable interest has developed, and out of that spilt the work of Biblical Counselling UK. This could be a very long answer, so you'll need to interrupt me. That, in a sense, the Biblical Counselling movement began slightly as a protest movement in the United States 60 years ago, when one particular pastor became frustrated that as the new psychotherapy and counselling movements in the secular world, which were quite new. I mean, they were sort of a brand new thing in the through the course of the last century. As they got going, more and more of the things that were previously dealt with by churches were finding their way out to secular counsellors, secular psychotherapists, and it was sort of saying, hasn't this always been church business, and how come we can't do it?
That's a really interesting topic, actually, because there was an article that garnered quite a lot of interest on the Gospel Coalition website, obviously the US version, about that topic, and about particularly women in general are perhaps looking outside the church for the help that in generations past would have been provided within the church. And I'm not going to get into the complexities of the arguments on either side, but I just thought it was interesting that that particular point about therapies or even medical help that is now available perhaps seems to be at the that you would defer to that rather than necessarily also seek a level of biblical helps or counselling. And again, yeah, I'm not going to get into the complexities. It's quite controversial. Do you know the article I'm talking about at all, either of you?
I do. I did read it. I thought it was quite interesting.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
lady tried to create a kind of a model, wasn't it, where there was the spiritual and there was the body, and then there was this kind of psychological thing where so you can get spiritual help and bodily help, spiritual help from the church, but there's another kind of whole area. So go into just a quick response to the point Lizzie and I were making about the tendency for people to seek help outside, almost exclusively outside, for a particular sort of constrained area called kind of the psychology or mental health or something that they would seek outside the church. Maybe start answering that question, and then we'll get into some more.
I think one of the things that is that because 60 years ago the biblical counselling movement began, as I say, in that sort of protest way, it is sometimes characterized as sort of being kind of anti things, which I think is not accurate.
Sure.
And because a lot has happened in 60 years, and in a sense, it's not so much sort of saying, kind of being against this. It's more saying, has the church slightly lost its nerve? Has the church forgotten that in the scriptures, we have everything needed for life and godliness, according to 2 Peter 1:3, and therefore we do have things to say about the whole realm. And I hadn't read the article that you were mentioning a moment ago, but in a sense, I'd want to say that the distinction between spiritual things and psychological things is not very helpful, because it produces exactly that kind of separation out. Here are some spiritual things that the church can deal with, praying and doing evangelism and the like. And then there are these psychological problems which haven't got anything to do with church or discipleship, and they need to be dealt with elsewhere. And I don't think that's a helpful distinction. I don't think the Bible describes us in that way.
No, but I guess and it will help because it will lead into you talking about the book you've written on trauma and the topic of trauma in general, that particularly for something like that, there are a whole series of fairly well documented medical responses, you might say, to trauma, which people go and do degrees and doctorates in and so forth, and have a degree of expertise in the kind of mechanics of the way the brain works in response to trauma. And is what area of discipline is that? And you could say, well, the scripture contains all we need for life and godliness, but it doesn't tell us how to set a broken leg or treat cancer. What category is this, for example, trauma in? with respect to that? Is it in the broken leg um, um, biological sort of cancer area, which is definable, or is it in the spiritual, I'm just sinning category? Where do you locate it?
Yeah, and the question you ask ultimately directs us down quite a complicated path about who we believe ourselves to be.
Yeah.
If we believe ourselves fundamentally to be nothing but our biochemistry, nothing but our biology, if we take that sort of view of the human person, that we are consistent, that we are fully explained by our brain chemistry and our neuroanatomy and the rest, and that's all there is to us, then you end up in a very different place to a biblical view of a person. And that it does center around that. Now, not saying that we're not interested in the body, and I think actually over Christian history, probably our theology of the body has been inadequately explored, and I think we need to do more of that quite urgently, precisely because of some of the issues that are developing around our understanding of the place of the body in the development of problems and in our response to them. But I think I want to hold on to the Scripture's conviction that we're spiritual beings, and we believe that spiritual realities are at play in our lives at all times.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I suppose I think there are so many complexities here, and I'm just beginning to think about how they interplay. And I suppose we might think about emotional wounding as something that I don't know, this is me as a pure layperson kind of interpreting this, but emotional wounding or severe trauma can then have implications that will then impact emotions, which will then have implications for relationships, and will also potentially have spiritual implications. Yeah, I just think it's very interesting that we've often only really thought about the way that we can fix the emotional side or sort to treat that through the physical or the physiological kind of roots, and perhaps abandon some of that spiritual element. I think what a lot of people are nervous about, and myself included, because yeah, I have sought medical help sometimes when it comes to mental health issues. I think some people are concerned that there's a disparaging of those that would seek medical help rather than perhaps seek spiritual advice or counsel or support, because they disqualify the idea that it is some kind of physiological or serious psychological issue. I think that's what a lot of people fear, that they'll be judged. Um, I don't,
And I think that in a sense is why the either orness is so
yeah,
unhelpful.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
if we say there are spiritual problems and there are psychological problems, then you end up in exactly that kind of polarized sort of
Yeah,
perspective.
sure.
And if you say as people, what is most importantly true about us is that we have a heart that worships,
Mm,
and it relates rightly or wrongly to God, but that that sort of that inner person, as the Bible describes it, is set in an outer person, and God chose to make us like that. So we've got a body, and then there's a whole realm of stuff around us, the
mm,
context in which we live, and God is interested in all of those,
mm,
and so should we be. Now that doesn't mean that we shouldn't seek um, wisdom in what's going on in our bodies, and how to respond to them. But we don't need to see that as somehow separated off from
Yep.
what's going on in our hearts or our souls. We are
It's
embodied souls.
yeah. I guess the complexity comes because the thing that's going on in our bodies is less of a biological phenomenon that's very easy to track, and um, people who study psychology and psychotherapy and those things, it's it is a treatment of not so much individual cells or organs. It's a kind of a treatment of a whole mood, isn't it? And so it overlaps very much with the spiritual, but in ways that probably most of us don't quite understand.
Yeah.
Is that fair, Steve?
Well, yes, it is. Uh, although there has been a measure of a simplification, certainly in the popular sort of understanding and sort of popular press,
Right.
that does want to reduce some of the the complicated emotional and psychological and spiritual issues that we face down into kind of simple biology. Depression is a serotonin deficiency, which there was great shock a few years ago when a story broke to say actually the evidence for that it doesn't seem to be adequate. But these things are simple explanations of there is this brain chemical and you haven't got enough of it and we need to give you a drug to give you a bit more of it, and that'll sort your depression out, just are too simplistic. It doesn't mean, and perhaps I need to say this quite quickly, it doesn't mean that there is something wrong in taking an antidepressant, but a kind of a view of what they're doing and what my difficulty is that requires me to take an antidepressant that only thinks in terms of my biology, I think is a bit deficient.
But leaving aside, because I wasn't so much talking about drugs, so leaving aside all drugs and just thinking about a secular, in a sense, not recognizing the spiritual kind of counseling, where people would say there is a medical expertise that's not so much looking at the biology of the brain, but just looking about how people work. And that overlap is a bit more subtle. So somebody might have CBT, for example, that's done by a secular counselor, where you could say they're not so much dealing with the biology, they're just dealing with this is how people work and this is how people can develop habits and so on. But they're not addressing any kind of spiritual issues about whether there's an idolatry, a lie they're believing or whatever. I don't know, speaking to that a little bit would help me.
Um, you are taking us into lots of complicated areas, Graham.
Yeah.
That I guess okay. Let me backtrack from that to ask to sort of come at it a slightly different angle.
Yeah.
If psychology attempts to explain what people do and why, then you could say that 4 of the fundamental questions that psychology is required to think about is first, what is a person? Are they, what's the best analogy for a person? Are they a complicated animal with behaviorism being sort of dominant? Are they best understood in terms of a sort of learning theory, and a bit like a computer model of the brain? What fundamentally is a person? What do we understand them to be? Second, what goes wrong with people? What is the fundamental difficulty that lands people in life struggles? Thirdly, how do you put them right? What is the therapeutic solution? And then finally, what's the goal of life? What's a life well lived? You've got to answer all of those questions. The psychologist has got to answer all those questions, and it didn't take you very long to see that those are spiritual questions. Those are questions about which Christians and the Bible all have views. So when you think about somebody having CBT, well, CBT comes with an understanding of people, what they are, what goes wrong with them, what puts them right, and what you're trying to accomplish.
Mm.
It had answers to all of those questions. They're not Christian answers.
Mm.
Now, that doesn't mean that people can't benefit from CBT.
Mm.
What it means is that wouldn't it be lovely if you had people who were as skilled as secular therapists and counsellors, but who, in their skillful understanding of people and their problems and the ways of putting them right, brought with them a biblical worldview. That would be your ideal, wouldn't it? That's
Yeah.
what a Christian would long for.
Yes,
And
definitely.
and in a sense, that's what the biblical counselling
Yeah.
vision is.
Really helpful. Let's do a worked example to do with trauma. Kick off with an easy question, or maybe not. What is trauma? And then we'll think about perhaps in some of those categories you asked about what went wrong and how we deal with it to do with trauma. So definition of trauma to start with would be good.
Yeah, that there's no single given definition of trauma that everybody agrees on. There are lots of different definitions from the American Psychological Association and the British Trauma Council and so on. What all the definitions sort of include to some degree is a past event or series of events that were so disturbing that they overwhelmed a person's capacity to cope with them, and that there often that there was some measure of powerlessness in the experience, helplessness, and the experience has ongoing effects into the present. So, if that sounded a bit complicated, some writers think in terms of 3 E's, which is just a little bit more memorable. There was an experience in the past, and that experience was overwhelming, and it. Sorry, start that again. There was an event in the past which they experienced as overwhelming, and it has effects in the present.
Right.
So an event or series of events that was experienced as overwhelming, and that has ongoing effects.
Do people sometimes talk about near-death experiences in the sense that somehow it's a brush with death, even if it's not literally a brush with death, it's either death of self or the potential of death or the potential of serious injury or so. Do sometimes people bring the proximity to death into definitions?
Yeah, no, some people do describe that. Ed Welsh in the Biblical Counselling work over in the States does use that phrase, a brush with death.
Yeah.
It tends to veer us towards kind of physical threat.
Right.
But I think it's important to understand that trauma could be experienced in sort of a different kind of threat. So a woman who is the subject of emotional abuse over a protracted period of time may not have feared physically for, there may not have been any violence, but nevertheless the abuse that she suffered has, in another sort of sense, sort of kind of extinguished her, brought her to doubt her own sanity, perhaps, and her own sort of ability to live independently because of the abuse that she suffered, and that could have ongoing effects of trauma.
A couple of scaling questions, brief answers to these, I think, which is it widespread? Let's just keep to the Christian population just for simplicity. Would it be that there are many people in most churches who are experiencing the effects of trauma, or would it be some people?
Quick answer is some people think in terms of big T trauma and little t trauma. If you think about little t trauma, then some calculate that 70% of us have experienced trauma.
Mhm.
In effect, we've been in some sort of upsetting road traffic accident. We've had a very disturbing bereavement. We've been the victim of an assault.
Mm.
I don't think that's terribly helpful, because I think that turns trauma into something that is too commonplace and makes it kind of rather invalidates the experience of people who have experienced some of the most sort of severe forms of suffering, hence big T trauma,
Mm.
which is a much smaller sort of part of the population.
Okay, and related to that, sorry, Lizzie, you asked the next one. Just really quick one. Do different people respond in different ways in the sense that someone may have had let's call it a near-death experience, and be adequately coping with it as a believer, in the sense that they have understood God's providence in it, they're not in denial about it, and then another person could have had exactly the same experience but not be dealing with it very well. Is that just obvious that there will be different categories of people who respond in different ways?
Yeah, absolutely. I think important not to attribute kind of moral or spiritual strength
Mm.
to one person sort of um, having ongoing effects from a traumatic incident and another person not. There will be lots of different reasons that may have a bearing upon that. But yes, what you say is true. It's simply a case of saying all the people who have experienced something beyond this point on some sort of scale of awfulness are
Mm.
all going to experience trauma, because remember, that is ongoing impact.
Mm.
That's part of the definition. It's not just the incident, it's the fact that it has an ongoing impact.
Mm.
And two people in the same situation can experience it in two very different ways.
That's really interesting. And I think, I mean, I have a lot of questions about the the implications of trauma language and also about the scale. So I suppose many years ago when we talked about trauma, we would be thinking about, say, soldiers in the First World War who had
Yeah.
experienced, who'd been exposed to ongoing threats to life, seen their friends be killed, had constant bombardment, very noisy explosions all around them, and being faced with the reality of their own death every day for, however many months or years. And I think everyone could acknowledge that that is immense trauma that will then have, for some, a lifelong impact. Um, and that doesn't negate then perhaps down the sliding scale, slightly less intensive experiences of trauma. However, I do have a concern that it has become a slightly overused or diluted term. And people will talk about trauma in all kinds of contexts. Does that matter though? Do you think that what we label the experiences and then the resulting psychological or holistic implications. Does it matter that some people feel traumatized by what might be relatively low level stuff? Do we treat all these people the same as Christians? Should we be expressing and extending immense empathy, even when objectively we might say that shouldn't have been a trauma-inducing event? Do I sound really uncaring now? I don't know whether I'm.
No, I think the observation you're making is a really important one. It's referred to in the literature in terms of concept creep.
Mm.
So a concept that is initially tightly defined to a relatively discrete group, then creeps outward and gathers in sort of more a much broader more loosely defined set of experiences. And to be honest, we're all guilty of it,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
we casually use the language of trauma. I mean, I'm in my 60s now. In my childhood, if something awful had happened to me, I would never say I'd have a traumatic day. I'd never have used that language.
Mm.
I'd have some other way to say, that was rubbish or whatever,
Mm.
but I wouldn't have talked about trauma. That was traumatic. We all do that now. It's dropped
Yeah.
into popular parlance,
I,
and
I guess
yes,
yeah, when it,
we have therefore we've therefore sort of taken away the language that is required for the sort of person you were describing earlier on, Liz,
Mm.
the person who has experienced the awfulness of the battlefield.
it's a
Mm.
difficult balance, isn't it, when people approach us because
Mm.
we can't really set ourselves up as the guardians of where it becomes enough traumatic that we can allow them to call it traumatic.
Yeah.
But we do have to take people as they are, don't we? But maybe gently pushing back. So we can observe sort of from a distance, yes, this is a problem of the language creep or definition creep, but with an individual approaching us, in a sense, we don't have to entirely endorse and say, well, this is your truth and it's all entirely true. But then we do have to kind of start with listening to what they're saying. So talk us through a little bit. If someone approaches you who says they have had a traumatic experience or they're struggling with a consequence of trauma, just a few kind of, I don't know, stepping stones as to things you might want to talk about, think about.
Yes, and yes,
I know it's a
in lots
big
of ways, the comments I'm making are, we're having a conversation about the way in which the language is used,
Mm.
and I think it is important to consider these sort of conceptual issues and
mm,
challenge them. But the point you're making, Graham, is that is a very different engagement with an individual.
Yeah.
How you would speak to somebody. I think there are two.
mm,
There are kind of two different errors that we can make. We can either consider trauma to be so complicated and so specialized that we feel, there's nothing we can do. We need to leave it all to the experts. Or alternatively, we can think, I'm a Christian, God's on my side, I've got an all-sufficient Bible, so I'm sure I can sort this out, and be overconfident. And both, I think, are errors that we're in danger of falling into.
Sure. What does just very quickly, I mean, as far as I'm aware, the Bible doesn't use the term trauma. But obviously it talks a lot about suffering. So where would you start in the Bible to help create some kind of framework for,
No, you're right. Trauma is a modern term, and um,
which obviously doesn't mean
we
it's an illegitimate term. It just means it's
no
not
no
necessarily something we take.
no. I mean, as with lots of things within our society at the moment, and particularly within the realm of psychology, we have to do some translation. We have to think. There are lots of psychological sort of complaints and difficulties that we recognise and understand and talk about today. That where do we find those in the Bible?
Yeah.
To talk about trauma particularly, I think probably the first place I would go would be the Book of Job,
Mhm.
with the awful things that happened to Job at the outset, and then as you read through the central chapters, which so often get ignored, um, you discover all sorts of ways that Job is describing intense anxiety, avoidance, disturbed sleep, desire to be dead, um, um, terror, hypervigilance, lots of the features that actually are recognized elements of the impact of trauma, including particularly PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So you can see those there in the way that Job is describing himself.
Mm.
So that would be one place I'd go. You think that there are others, um, but certainly lots of descriptions of severe suffering. It's slightly harder elsewhere to say there is obvious ongoing impact in a person's life, which, as I said earlier, is part of the understanding of what trauma involves.
Would you describe the cross as a traumatic experience for Christ? Bit of a
Um,
mischievous question, really.
it certainly is an experience of severe suffering,
Mm,
clearly the severest of suffering. And I think part of the way that you would begin to, one of the ways in which you might begin to help somebody think about a Christian response to trauma is to recognize that in the cross, you have the ugliest, most awful event in human history, which, because of God's overarching purposes, becomes, to our astonishment, a beautiful thing of
Mm,
glorious redemption.
mm,
And if God can do that with the death of his own son, then you begin to put in front of somebody who's experienced something awful the recognition that perhaps he can do something, even with their awful
mm,
experience.
yes, and I guess also Jesus operates with faith throughout, doesn't he? In a way that's exemplary in terms of how we respond to trauma. In a way that Job, although he doesn't curse God, he does wobble more in his response. So
mm.
maybe Jesus is a counterexample in that sense. If you wanted to connect it with trauma.
Mm.
Um,
Do you think, I mean, just thinking about ancient times as well, and this is a slight tangent, but I'm just thinking about the level of suffering that many people in the ancient world would have gone through would have far exceeded anyone in our day and age and most, even the last couple of hundred years. I'm just wondering whether there's anything in that that means, and this is from a purely objective kind of secular perspective, that it's very difficult to compare our sort of our responses now to suffering. Do you think perhaps there's a level of our nervous systems are hyper alert to any level of suffering, which then is interpreted as more traumatic? Because I just think back to, crucifixion. Jesus was not the first person to be crucified. Executions, public executions would have been relatively commonplace, I suppose. And, you know, children mortality would have been very high. Very violent deaths would have been more commonplace. I suppose I'm just thinking those kinds of experience would have been expected to a greater degree, which means that perhaps there is more of this communal resilience. I don't know, maybe I'm just hypothesizing here.
I think your observations would be backed up by some studies. I'm not an expert in these cultural studies, but I did come across in the research. I did some studies which suggested that different soldiers in different countries who therefore had different experiences of exposure to actual military combat, where there was cultural kind of familiarity
Mm,
in the way you're describing of terrible things happening, of being involved in military combat, those soldiers seem to be more resilient to traumatic events than countries where there was not that expectation or familiarity
mm.
with severely traumatic incidents.
Yeah, just picking up the story again. So we've avoided these two extremes of that you've mentioned, of thinking I've just got the Bible and I can sort it, and so on. But what would your kind of next steps be? Let's
mm,
assume it is something that we would all kind of, three of us at least, understand as fairly significant traumatic experience, using all the scaling discussions we had just now, but we still think it was significant. Where would you go then? And yeah, where would you go then? There's supplementary questions to that, but what are you doing now with a person?
I think I'm asking them what they would find helpful.
Mhm.
and what kind of conversation um, they think um, would be of benefit to them. It's really important to recognize that where people are encouraged to revisit a traumatic experience from the past, um, and that all too easily happens because we think, oh, it's good for people to get things off their chest, and I'm sure it's good to talk about things. Where people revisit a traumatic incident from the past, it is for them like re-experiencing it.
Mm,
And this notion of re-traumatization, where somebody says, "Oh, tell me what happened,"
mm,
and they start quizzing them, asking lots of questions. Um, one of the ways of understanding trauma is that a person, because they were overwhelmed in the experience, have not been able to lay down a normal memory, and
mm,
because they haven't managed to lay down a normal memory of the event, that's why it kind of intrudes into their present, unbidden and in terrifying form, because
mm,
it is like they're there again. They're not able to kind of separate themselves present with this memory of something that happened in the past. It is as if it is reoccurring. So the idea of, oh, do tell me what happened, and I'll ask you lots of questions about it because it's good for you to get it off your chest, can actually be very damaging and hurtful and make things worse. So hence my comment, Graham, to say I want to begin the question by saying, what would you find helpful?
Mm.
mm, mm.
Did you want to talk about what happened, or is that unhelpful?
What if they say something along the lines of that? I want it to not impact on me in the way that it is, where it kind of dominates my thoughts and modifies my behavior in an unbiblical, ruining fellowship kind of way. So they say something along those lines. I want help. What are you going to
Then
say?
we'd better find somebody who has the wisdom and experience to
Mm,
help you.
mm,
And if
Um,
that's not me, I'm not going to start trying. I'm not going to start meddling.
mm.
That's what I would say,
That I think
because
that
it's well established that
mm,
that there are three phases to helping somebody recover from trauma. The first of those is establishing a sense of safety,
mm,
yeah,
and only once a sense of safety is established, can you then begin to revisit the experience,
mm,
and then begin to think about reintegrating into activities and socializing and re-establishing life in a way that has been hampered by their trauma.
what were
So
the three stages? Sorry, there was.
establishing safety,
Yeah.
revisiting the experience, and
Okay.
then reintegrating into life,
mm,
would be one way of describing it, and
Yeah.
that's sort of been long established in the trauma literature.
But I'm an average pastor in Doncaster area,
mm.
and not that your husband is at all average, but
It's very average.
someone approaches me, and I do what you just said, Steve. I ask them what they want to do. They say, I want help. Da, da, da. And how do you know whether you have sufficient wisdom to even start a conversation, or you say, I do not have wisdom? What's the criteria for deciding whether you have sufficient?
Um, have you um, have you done any training?
Mm,
Have
mm,
you have you have you read any books? Have you talked to people who have been through trauma and been helped, and um, asked them about what helped them,
mm,
and learnt from their experience? Um, I think if the answer to those questions is, well, no, or I've listened to a podcast from Affinity, and that's about the sum total, then you're not in a place
yeah.
to offer them help. And I mean, I'm going to sound like I'm giving a commercial now, but yeah, I mean, this is why
Yeah.
I've got involved in Biblical Counselling UK, is because we want to raise the level of knowledge, wisdom, capacity, skill, right across the church family, of people being able to help others, in all sorts of areas of life. I think because we've stopped doing it, we've become poor at it.
Mhm.
And we need to rebuild our confidence, but we mustn't get ahead of ourselves.
So in terms of biblical categories, you're not suggesting there's a kind of body of wisdom that's kind of outside the church, like it's in BCUK and it's in training, but it's not in the Bible and in the leadership of the church. It's just you're saying there's some specialist kind of gifting, I guess, that is part of God's gift to the church that may be exercised in a number of different people in a given church. Does that make sense as a question? I'm kind
I
of
don't,
trying
is that what you're saying, Steve?
I,
I
I,
understood it slightly differently, that there might be people who have special understanding of trauma itself and its impact and how it kind of plays out and then how it needs to be responded to, who can then apply biblical counsel at the appropriate time. I don't know.
um, yes. What's another way of answering this question? I mean, the Puritans were really good at pastoral care.
yeah.
Mm.
They wrote vast tomes describing all sorts of things that affected people,
Mm.
and how to make sense of them and understand them. And they predated any psychological theories. They weren't encumbered by those views. Did that make them unsophisticated? Not at all. They were
Yeah.
very sophisticated in their pastoral care. Um, the history, if you like, is that we stopped doing that. We
Mm.
let go of that kind of wise and sophisticated pastoral care because we passed the baton to somebody else. We
Yeah.
said that the psychologists and the counselors can do all of this, um,
So, yeah.
and
But, yeah.
and so it's re it's reskilling ourselves. It's saying this is church business.
Mm.
Mm. Mm.
So if I was to put it crudely, it's in a sense you're not saying the Bible is inadequate, we need some expert knowledge. You're saying many churches and church leaderships have not given sufficient time and reflection to the application of those biblical principles to helping people
Well, I suppose
do other things. Yeah,
if I'm going to impose my interpretation, I suppose it's a cyclical thing, isn't it?
yeah,
If if people with those needs don't go to the church, then the church doesn't kind of develop or doesn't resource people to be able to deal with those things well, not just in a kind of glib, shallow, read a psalm way, but doesn't do what the Puritans did and
no,
spent a lot of sort of time applying biblical wisdom to their introspective kind of meanderings. And
uh,
I don't
yeah,
know. I guess I'm saying, yeah, no, I grasp a little more perhaps of,
No, you're right. If we stop doing it, then of course you become poor at it, and
yeah.
the less you do it, the less good you're at it. Good you are at it, and then of course people don't come to you because you're no good at it, and they go somewhere else and they find something more helpful.
Mm,
Then of course that's where they'll go. So it is going to take a bit of effort to
mm,
reverse that trend. Um,
yeah. I mean, skilling up is brilliant. But by the way, this is in the context of me being very positive about it. We, as Steve would know, we have my co-pastor who's now tutoring, in fact, for BCUK, and other people in the church who are trained and so forth. And I'm part of a local group as well. So we are very positive about it.
yeah.
I think I have moments because I think it's quite hard of just kind of working out where all the overlaps are.
Mm, mm,
And particularly if someone approaches with an issue, someone in the church who's perhaps not part of the leadership is counseling that person, quite where the overlap of accountability and spiritual input and spiritual responsibility sort of like get sometimes a bit complicated. But I think
mm,
they're problems worth solving
mm.
rather than saying this is too difficult. But I do think they are problems that need solving at times to do with how the various overlaps work and the overlaps with outside agencies as well.
I
Maybe
suppose
not just us.
the two kind of mistakes would be thinking anyone just with the best intentions can go in and be a help to someone with trauma. We have this phrase of one anothering at church, which in general is brilliant. We kind of come alongside one another. We speak biblical truths to each other to encourage each other's souls and to truly walk alongside each other through struggles. But that isn't necessarily going to be helpful for someone who's experienced trauma and is then really suffering because we may not understand quite how to apply wisdom. Whereas the other option is, well, we only outsource this to medical or psychological professionals. And I guess what you're saying is we need to get back to equipping and empowering the church to do what they've been doing, albeit perhaps not always perfectly, but for, thousands of years.
I mean, the one anothering is valuable as long as you
Mm.
know what you're capable of. I mean,
Yeah.
you can, you know, we don't, if somebody develops acute myeloid leukemia, we don't say, well, I don't know anything about acute myeloid leukemia, so I'm not gonna come alongside that person.
Sure.
We think, oh gosh, they're facing something awful. Let
Yeah.
me, let me love them, let me love their family. Um, in a similar sort of way, um, somebody who's facing something incredibly complicated, they've developed severe anorexia nervosa, they've developed a psychotic illness. We
Mm.
may not, we don't imagine that we have the expertise to step in and solve their difficulties, but we can still come alongside them
Yeah.
with practical care and support and love and compassion, and we should. But wouldn't it be great if we also, bit by bit,
Mm.
gradually raise the level of competency
Mhm.
across our whole church communities,
Mm.
and also, we're developing some people at the more complex end who did have the experience
Mm.
to think Christianly about eating disorders and about psychosis.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And yeah, personally, I'm very positive about it. And I think, I don't know if this is a rubbish analogy, but, and I know you do stuff to do with marriage anyway, but if you just take it out of the BCUK world, to do with marriages, I think we would say there's loads of biblical teaching, and you've got all you need in the Bible in terms of how to live well as a married couple. You, as a pastor of a church, may know the principles and be reasonable at chatting with people about it, but there may be other people in the church who are perhaps not part of the leadership who have taken more time to train and reflect and be practitioners with lots of married couples and actually are better at it than you. And I think there's a humility you have to exercise to say that's better that they follow up with that married couple than I do because I'm not the expert. But that's the kind of interface I was kind of talking about.
I think that's a really helpful analogy because I think talking with a couple
Yeah.
is incredibly skilled
Yes.
discipline. It's and when you see somebody who has done a lot of it, it's I find it just glorious to watch. I think that is so skillful what they are managing to do in helping that couple to communicate, to identify underlying issues that are so important. And you realize that's a highly skilled thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
but you can do it Christianly, and that's the sort of the ideal that
Mm.
we want to be working towards.
Sure.
Yeah, and there's a kind of reporting into the leadership of the church that doesn't need to say all the details of what was discussed, but you have to build up lots of trust links and communication links that work well in that. Do you
Yeah,
know,
absolutely,
we
absolutely.
pretty
I
much,
mean,
yeah,
working out how to maintain uh, the authority and the pastoral sort of responsibility within a church community is
yeah.
absolutely key.
Can I ask a
Go
very
on.
brief question about something that's come up now? I work in the realm of education, and one of the things I'm still kind of teetering on the fence about is this idea of something that's become very common in education, and that's being a trauma-informed school and then you can sort of pass that over to being a trauma-informed church. Now, is that something that could be genuinely helpful for the church, as in, training members of the congregation on being trauma-informed? Or is that potentially something that then adds to the narrative of trauma perhaps replacing a level of normal suffering in our lives? I don't know. I'm completely on the fence about this, because you don't want to allow trauma to become the identity of a certain proportion
Mhm.
of your congregation, because I don't think that actually does them any good or the church any good. But at the same time, if we're not dealing with the potential that there will be people in the church with trauma, and if we're not dealing with that in a helpful way, it could be more damaging. I don't know. What do you think?
It it's a contentious term, probably more contentious over in the US than in the UK at the moment. And I think some of it, some of the contention revolves around different meanings
Sure.
tucked in within it. If by trauma informed we mean we absorb everything, all the understandings that exist within the secular world about, what trauma is, how it affects a person, what the solutions are, and so on, then that's one thing. It's rather different to say we're not ignorant about the impact that trauma can have in a person's life. And so if you come and tell us that you've faced some trauma and it's continued to impact you, we won't kind of look puzzled as if we don't know what you're talking about.
Sure. Yeah.
Those are two rather different
Yeah.
things. And I think that the latter seems to me to be, the world is talking about trauma, and if the church kind of doesn't know anything about it and looks a bit blank, or is sort of cynical and dismissive, then I think we look a bit out of step with our culture, and we want to be able to speak truth into our culture.
Yeah.
All really helpful stuff, and we've taken you off on a few little bypass. We're pretty much out of time. Just as we wrap up, Steve, it would be really good if you remind us the title of your book, and also where we can get more information about BCUK.
I'd be glad to do that. The book is called Understanding Trauma, and the subtitle is A Biblical Introduction for Church Care. And the subtitle is important because it is only an introduction. It's a big topic, but it is trying to say, how do we do this better in our churches?
Yes.
And information about BCUK, the best place to go is, it won't surprise you to know, to go to our website, bcuk.org, and you'll see information about our training and various resources available there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
No, thank you for having me, and thank you for the stimulating questions.
Thank you so much for listening to Affinity Talks Gospel Podcast. Affinity is a network of evangelical churches and Christian organizations working together, sharing stories in order to encourage and equip God's people to preach and live the gospel in this generation. If you're interested in supporting this ministry, we'd love you to join us. Just head over to affinity.org.uk/join to find out more. And we look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of Affinity Talks Gospel.